This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 205 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we'll learn about one way teachers can use the AI tool ChatGPT as an example machine. The technology known as ChatGPT, a chatbot powered by artificial intelligence, has been one of the hottest topics of conversation in the past few months, especially among educators. A lot of that conversation has focused on the concern, even panic, that this tool offers unprecedented opportunities for a new form of plagiarism, that it marks the end of writing instruction as we know it, that from this point forward, students will stop trying to create any original writing on their own and use AI to write for them. This is a legitimate concern, and lots of educators are actively and creatively developing strategies for addressing it. In episode 202, where ChatGPT was one of the 6 tools to check out for this year, we dug into a little bit of that. But today we're considering one way this tool can help teachers do their work more quickly and effectively by using it as what we're calling an example machine. In order to learn any concept well, students need to experience multiple varied examples of that concept. And coming up with those examples can be a time-consuming task for teachers. In today's episode, my guests Chris Ma and Sarah Levine walk us through how to get the most out of this process. Sarah is an assistant professor of education at Stanford University who has been on the podcast twice before. In episode 162, where she shared a literature response strategy called Up, Down, Both, Why, and episode 187, where we learned about another teaching strategy called contrasting cases. In this episode, Sarah is joined by Chris Ma, a PhD student at Stanford who currently serves as her graduate assistant. Chris and Sarah have co-written a post that shows us in detail how they prompt ChatGPT for examples, then revise their prompts until they get exactly what they need from it. While this episode is absolutely a worthwhile listen, I strongly encourage you to go over to cultofpedagogy.com and read their post to fully understand the process and see the examples themselves. After that, I would encourage you to follow up by reading the post on the contrasting cases strategy, which would be a perfect fit for lessons that use the kinds of examples generated by ChatGPT that we talk about in this episode. So just go over to the podcast page on the site and go to episode 205 to read the post that we talk about today, and then 187 to read about contrasting cases. So before I play our interview, I would like to thank ListenWise for sponsoring this episode. ListenWise provides short, high-quality, age-appropriate podcasts for grades 2 through 12. Save time with pre-made lessons designed to build students' background knowledge and academic vocabulary. Keep students on grade level with scaffolding and differentiation. It's great practice for meeting listening and speaking standards. With ListenWise Premium, you get comprehension tools like quizzes, interactive transcripts, a text-to-speech toolbar with Spanish translations, graphic organizers, and more. It's perfect for English language learners. Learn more and sign up for free at cultofpedagogy.com/listenwise. Support also comes from Wipebook. Having a whiteboard in your classroom is incredibly useful, but sometimes there isn't enough room for everyone to participate. That's where Wipebook steps in with their reusable flip charts, an eco-friendly, affordable extension to whiteboards, which come with 10 double-sided sheets. Each sheet is 2 by 3 feet and detachable so you can hang it anywhere. With one blank side and the other gridded, they are perfect to work on solving math problems. With the free Wipebook Scan app, you can save your work directly to the cloud, then wipe the page clean and start again. That creates an unlimited, non-permanent surface. And now, if you go to wipebook.com/cultofpedagogy, that's wipebook.com/cultofpedagogy, you can enter their weekly giveaway to win a free Wipebook flip chart pack. The giveaway resets every week, and the winners are announced on Twitter at Wipebook. So follow them on Twitter to stay updated and take a look at all their other amazing reusable products at wipebook.com, wipebook.com. Now here's my conversation with Chris Ma and Sarah Levine about how to use ChatGPT as an example machine. I have Chris Ma and Sarah Levine here. This is Sarah's third time on the podcast.
Yay.
And Chris is, you work together at Stanford, correct?
Yes, Sarah's my advisor.
Okay. And so we are going to be talking about ChatGPT today and a very specific use. You all came to me with this idea. So why don't you, let me let you sort of introduce kind of where this idea even came from the two of you.
This ChatGPT, craziness that's kind of washed over teaching and learning over the past couple of months has a lot of people, both in K-12 and college level, just going nuts. And one of the things that I'm really interested in generally, whether there's a ChatGPT around or not, is how teachers can use a bunch of different examples of a thing to help students learn about that thing. And I started playing around with ChatGPT and asking it to create some of those examples for me. And it's so quick and it responds pretty well to instruction. And it saved me just tons of time when I was planning lessons for my own students. So Chris and I began thinking about the hardest thing about using ChatGPT as a teaching tool in this way, and that is figuring out how to prompt it. And we thought teachers might appreciate a little learning from our mistakes, basically, as we learn to prompt the tool to give us what we wanted for our teaching.
Yes. So what we're talking about, let's talk about the use of examples in general as a learning tool. Why is it important to have multiple examples for things when we're teaching?
One of the most important ways that people learn is through the use of examples. Some general principles here: more examples are better than one. And in the learning sciences, we call this contrasting cases. So basically, the idea is if you want to teach a young child what a circle is, they also need to know what it is not. So they need to know what a square is. They need to know what a triangle is. And then really importantly, they also need to know what an oval is. And so by creating these kind of contrasting examples, we're helping students build a mental model of the concept or the thing that we're trying to teach them.
Right. And typically we have either had to get those examples when we're teaching from our own heads, or we have to Google stuff, or we hopefully find them in a textbook or other teaching materials.
Exactly.
But you all have found that ChatGPT is actually a really, really good source of pulling together examples of things when we're trying to teach.
And that takes a lot of time to both come up with the examples and the right examples. And so, ChatGPT is not always perfect, but it can give you a list of examples to kind of curate. And so teachers can use this really flexibly to just generate a bunch of examples and then curate the ones that kind of fit the concept best.
Yeah, another thing I really like about it in terms of its example-ness is that you can use it not just as a way to present, let's say, 5 first paragraphs for a college essay that students can look at and say, this one's stronger, this one's weaker. But you can also use it as a tool for conversation with a student, so that when you give a student an assignment like an argument, which many of us do, and when that assignment comes kind of in a vacuum, as in create an argument about, instead of asking students to do that task solo, we can get ChatGPT to create the other side of the argument that students can then respond to. So then they feel like there's a reason, or at least a little bit more of a reason, that they are arguing, and they have different claims and pieces of evidence that they might want to respond to. I don't think this is cheating. I think this is how we argue in the real world. And I think it actually can increase students' capacity for understanding the thing they're arguing about.
Yeah. A different way to think about that is that learning is a very social activity. And oftentimes what we do in traditional schooling is we ask kids to do the learning just in isolation without any sort of thought partner, without any sort of dialogue. And it's very difficult sometimes for a teacher to step in and kind of be that thought partner with individual students. And so having
Mm.
ChatGPT as like a virtual thought partner can be really powerful.
So you have a sort of protocol basically for prompting to follow. So let's just talk about that. And then we're going to go through some examples of what that looks like. So let's hear the steps first, and then we're going to walk through a bunch of examples.
Okay, so here are the steps. They're not catchy, but they are the ones that we've been using. So when you are using ChatGPT as kind of this example machine that's just churning out different versions of something so that students can get a better mental model of that thing, um, you have to kind of first decide what it is you want kids to focus on, or what are kind of the best possible examples you could give to a student.
Mhm.
So, for example, if you're talking about, I'm going to use the example of an argument about a piece of literature because that's where I'm most comfortable talking. If you know that your kids are really struggling with finding excerpts from a text to support an idea, then you might want to think about what does a best version of that look like. Ask ChatGPT to create that thing,
Mhm.
take a look at it, review and adapt, because sometimes it spits out something that you don't want and you got to go back and
Mm.
adapt. And we'll talk about how to do that. And then prompt it to create examples that are bad examples of that thing, or
Mhm.
unclear examples, or stronger and weaker. So if it's all about finding excerpts that support a claim, here's a really good set of excerpts from a text that supports a claim. Here's one where there's no evidence at all. Here's one where you have one piece of evidence, but it doesn't connect to the claim at all. Or
Mhm.
here's one where you summarize but don't actually use evidence. All of those things will help students focus on how strong evidence works, and they don't have to worry about some of the mess of the examples being about different subject matter or in different styles, because you are the one who is creating them.
Right. And you can be that specific. All those things that you just said, you can be that specific with ChatGPT. And the important thing is to review what it gives you and not just expect perfection, because a lot of it has to do with what inputs you give it to begin with.
Exactly. Most teachers know now that ChatGPT, as I think we say somewhere in the blog, will do exactly what you tell it to and nothing else. So it is, in a way, it's kind of Amelia Bedelia-ish. And
Mhm.
sometimes, for example, if you wanted to give 3 examples of different kinds of government, but you don't want to mention the names of those kinds of governments because you want kids to figure it out,
Right.
and you prompt it, give an example of communism, but don't mention communism, it might give back, sure, here's an example of a thing that other people would call communism, but that we won't use the word communism to describe, just so
Right.
sometimes you really have to kind of knock it on the head.
And I mean, I also think that, I mean, sometimes you can copy and paste what it gives you and make tweaks to it also.
That's right. And you
Yeah.
don't actually even need to copy and paste. If it's given it to you, then you can say, now rewrite that, but.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to review the steps one more time just for people listening. So you established criteria, you prompt. So first is establish criteria, 2 is prompt, 3 is review and adapt what it gives you.
Right.
Then 4 is to prompt it for contrasting cases. Once you get your example that you like, then you give a prompt for non-examples or different examples,
That's
and
right.
then review those and adapt. So let's start with a really simple example. You've got here kinetic energy. So you've asked ChatGPT, and the prompt you said is, give me 5 real life examples of kinetic energy. And what it gives back to you is a car moving down the highway, a soccer ball being kicked, a wind turbine spinning, a person jumping off a diving board, and a waterfall cascading down a cliff. So what happens next after it gives you those?
First, you get a science teacher to make sure that those things are right, because we were not sure. One of them, at least one of them, I wasn't sure if it really worked. But so you review, and
Mhm.
based on your own knowledge, you determine whether ChatGPT has given you something that's actually accurate
Mhm.
and that will be clear enough as a set of examples for your students and won't muddy the waters.
Okay. So then once you're sort of happy with those, then you prompt it for contrasting cases. So what would you ask next?
You might say specifically, because you gave it a prompt about one kind of energy, kinetic energy, you can literally say, okay, now give me 5 real life examples of potential energy.
Right. And then it gives you those: a stretched rubber band, water behind a dam, a book on a shelf, a roller coaster at the top of a hill, and a bow before releasing an arrow.
Right.
So you've got those, you're feeling pretty good about that. But then you wanted to take it another step further.
Right. Let's say you realize that you want to up the complexity for your kids. You think they're going to identify these different examples pretty well. So you want to supply your kids with a couple of more ambiguous examples, or maybe examples that include both types of energy, so that they're going to have to really think about each example and think about the underlying principles of those two kinds of energy.
Yeah, and so in this example, we would ask it to give us an example of maybe an example that includes both kinetic and potential energy. And so another way of thinking of what Sarah just said is we want kids to come up with the rules. We want them to construct the rules of what's kinetic and what's potential. And so ChatGPT can help us do this by creating ambiguous examples for us.
And so you would take things like this, and these could turn into sort of exercise or discussions or group activity where they have to sort them maybe into kinetic or potential or something like that.
Exactly.
And so this one that has both, it says a car moving down a hill. It has kinetic energy due to its motion and potential due to its position at the top of the hill. As it moves down the hill, the potential is converted to kinetic. So that in that case, you would then shorten it to just a car moving down the hill and see if the kids can generate these thoughts about it.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Got it.
And there's endless variations you can do with this. One thing Sarah pointed out that I want to just kind of underline is ChatGPT is conversational, so you can iterate on the prompt. It remembers. I'm using air quotes here. It remembers what you said last, so it's really different from a search engine in that respect. It kind of follows the path of a conversation as opposed to treating each query as like a unique standalone thing.
It's funny that you said that, because I just noticed about your last prompt, all you said was, now give me an example that involves both types of energy. You didn't say potential and kinetic. And so I was wondering, like, how did it know that that's
right.
what you were talking about? Because it was following the thread of the conversation.
Yep.
Exactly.
And this is because it's trained to recognize sort of normal speech patterns and in a way that a search engine like Google is not. Whereas Google is just looking at the query itself. ChatGPT is keeping track of the conversation, basically.
Yeah, and it's able to refer back to something you said earlier as opposed to coming at it fresh every time.
That's right. And that's part of the reason why we use this kind of simple example of something that a teacher has come up on their own, a million times. Teachers have done this kind of matching exercise in order to help their kids figure out underlying principles a million times before. But now this tool is so fast that it allows teachers more time to play around with the creative aspects of this exercise, as opposed to generating or finding or remembering or looking for your old lesson plans, as opposed to taking time doing that.
Well, and that actually leads right into this next example that we looked at, where you gave it the prompt to give you this is about a process where it can give you steps of a process. And you asked it to give a step-by-step explanation of the life cycle of a seed. And you asked it to give it to you as it would explain it to a 5-year-old, so that it would be very simple. So it gives you the steps: seed planted in the ground, and then it wakes up when it's warm, and then there's a sprout that grows, and so on and so forth. And then your next prompts to it were to just rearrange it and then take some steps out. And I asked you, could you not just do that with the initial list of examples? And that was what you said, was that you can, but it can just do it so much faster.
Yeah, of course you can. Teachers can do all of this stuff. We just like leaning on this AI to save us some time, so that we, instead of, again, taking a little more time to generate all of this stuff, we've got it in front of us, and now we can play with it and figure out how our kids can play with it.
And I would add here, for the post, we deliberately used pretty simple examples just to illustrate the concept. this example we used would have been appropriate in an elementary school classroom. But once you get up to the upper grades and you're thinking about high school examples, when you're thinking about
Right.
like processes of, the respiratory system or something, it gets more complex, and that takes more time for teachers to generate than something like the seed
Right.
example. Again, just kind of using the simple example to illustrate the concept. It's going to get
Yeah.
much more complex and much more time consuming as the concepts kids are learning gets more complex too.
Jen, can I just add one more thing about this example right here?
Mm-hmm.
So this is this example of step-by-step explanation of the life cycle of a seed for a 5-year-old. And we used that term to get pretty direct language. So we're missing some nuance for sure.
Mm.
Another kind of contrasting case that you could use here is to ask the bot now to describe the same steps, but use scientific language. And
Mm.
then an exercise is figuring out the relationship between the concepts as they're described in the 5-year-old version with the scientific language described in the new version. So to help kids kind of map the more complicated scientific concept, or at least the name, onto the process.
So it's almost like you're creating your own set of Cliff's notes for the harder version, basically. Would
I
would
think
the same group of students be reading both versions?
Right. So, for example, if you wanted to teach a couple of different scientific terms,
Mm-hmm.
let's assume, kids know what it means to have a seed wake up because they can see that metaphor, but they
Mm-hmm.
might not know, germinate uh, or other scientific terms. So now they have both of them together, and it's
Yeah.
easier for them to see how this more complicated term that they haven't heard before maps onto this idea or image that they have.
Right. And while we're on this topic of sort of adjusting the language of the same process, this is something that we bring up later in the post, but we can definitely talk about it right now. It's such a great tool for differentiating too, because you can create these examples and then you can have it translate them into Spanish or Vietnamese, right? Or any other language,
Yeah, absolutely.
and write
Yeah.
it at different reading levels or.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked to a lot of teachers who make the comparison with News ELA and being able
Yeah.
to take, I've taught in classes where I've had kids reading at fourth grade level and 10th grade level sitting next to each other. And so if
Mm-hmm.
you have a New York Times article that you're trying to get all kids to understand, um, being able to just put it into ChatGPT and making 3 different versions of it
Mm-hmm.
um, is going to be just a game changer for teachers that have a wide range of reading levels.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's what I love about News ELA is that, but the thing is you had to rely on them to pick the stuff that you need. This now you can do it with anything.
Yes. And now your kids have that capacity too. Now they can take that article and say, make this easier for me to understand.
When that happens, to do that, do you just copy the entire text right into the prompt box on ChatGPT and then it will give it back to
Yeah,
you?
you can literally say rewrite this at an 8th grade level or something. One thing that I really want to stress here is I think there's some rush to say, oh, if you're doing that, you're like lowering the bar for kids or you're making it too easy or something like that. I actually, I mean, I think there's a bunch of ways to address that point. Um,
Mm.
one way I would say is, you're primarily doing this for readings where you want kids to understand the concepts, and you might not be
Right.
as concerned with like the close reading of the
Mm-hmm.
technical craft of the writing. And then secondly, what I would say is, a lot of what we know about reading research is kids have multiple reading levels, not just one. Kids can read with an adult coaching them at one level, but independently they might read at a totally different level.
Mm.
And so for me, this is much more about putting texts in front of kids that are at the appropriate level for their independent reading. And that's just a really, really tall order if you don't have some way to automate it. And so this is, like I said, it could be a game changer for a lot of students who just for whatever reason, aren't able to access the texts that are put in front of them. This just opens the door for them to access a whole new world of ideas and texts.
Yeah, and you know what you said a few minutes ago too about this same idea of like you can actually have the kids do this for themselves. I'm thinking just the metacognitive possibilities for getting a student to look at a text and understand, is this a Do I need it in simpler language? Is this a knowledge issue? Is this just a world that I'm not familiar with? So do I need the vocabulary explained a little bit more simply? That's a huge game changer for these students as learners and teaching them how to use technology to grow.
Yes, I think there is a lot about this tool that's going to make us all more reflective about how we read and how we learn as we communicate with this machine to say, up the complexity, lower the complexity, explain these 5 words, explain this in another way.
Yeah.
But I also want to warn, once, as we said before, it's always about reviewing, because this bot doesn't know when it's wrong, and it can get things wrong, and it can summarize incorrectly, and certainly can translate incorrectly. And in fact, when you go beyond, for example, Spanish, Chinese, more common languages, it does a poorer and poorer job of translating.
Okay.
Just because it hasn't had the exposure. So always with skepticism.
Yes, and we've been overwhelmingly enthusiastic and optimistic about it in the first half of this call. But there are very real limitations which we can certainly dig into as well, including the ones that Sarah mentioned.
Right. And it asks for feedback, correct? When it gives you, I mean, it depends on whether the person is willing to, it asks for like a thumbs up, thumbs down. Does it not, when it gives you prompts back or response to prompts?
It does, but that won't help you. That'll just help the machine.
This is just going to help the machine get better over time.
That's right. That's not for us. That's for the machine. So it can become our overlord more quickly.
Right.
But I do think you can say to it, I don't think that's right. Or, and it is very apologetic. It will say, I'm sorry, I was wrong about that. But it might be wrong about being wrong. So this is why we are focused here on what teachers can do with this tool as opposed to what kids can do with it.
Right. And that's why the review and adapt part is so important. You're not just prompting and taking whatever it says. That's really a key point here.
Yeah,
that's right.
I think that's absolutely true for the moment. There are lots of people who are already thinking about the ways that kids can use it directly. And I think the tool will get there. Right now, because of a lot of the inaccuracies and limitations that Sarah mentioned and other things, I think our stance was we wanted to start with teachers, partly because it takes some finessing, it takes some prompting, it takes some skill to write the right prompts. It takes a lot of kind of careful curation. And so that's where we wanted to start our focus for this article.
And so before we move on from this first example of sort of sequencing things, you also offer some other subject areas. So in social studies, you talk about being able to sequence historical events. In math, sequencing steps in an approach to solving a proof. In English or language arts classes, sequencing events in a novel. And so there's a lot of different uses just in terms of steps for things. The next area that you are exploring is teaching conceptual knowledge of concepts. So let's talk a little bit about the big example that you use there, and then we'll talk about other uses for that.
One of the things you might have seen most online is people playing around with ChatGPT's ability to mimic the style of different writers or different genres. Mm-hmm. So we were kind of playing around with that here. And one of the things that kids have a hard time working with, for example, in English language arts, is thinking not just about what an author is saying or where a character is going, but the craft that the author is using to describe a thing. So authorial craft, style, tone, language, all of that stuff. So now we can take much less time in creating contrasting cases. It's still fun. I still really enjoyed it, even though I wasn't doing them myself. I did a lot of tweaking of them, and that made them fun too. So we're thinking about how to give different sets of examples of style that will help students recognize the difference between one set of styles and another. Mm-hmm. And there's a million ways to do this, including, looking at your favorite singer styles, looking at the lyrics of different songs where kids are more familiar. But if we wanted to focus on authors that we've been reading, for example, you might take something that a content that kids are familiar with, let's say McDonald's, and make a review of McDonald's in the style of 3 different authors that you've been reading.
Your first one was asking them to review McDonald's in the style of Edgar Allan Poe, which we've got the full examples on the blog post, but it starts off, it was a dreary and tempestuous night when I found myself wandering in search of sustenance. My steps led me to the threshold of McDonald's, its facade illuminated by a sickly yellow glow, and so on and so forth. And so now we have a lot of heavy duty Poe here.
Right.
Yeah. And
it's almost too easy, really.
But then the example that you gave, you wanted it to go a little harder, basically. And so how did you prompt it to change that a little bit?
Right, because a thing I decided, let's say I'm teaching this in my high school ELA class, is that I don't just want kids to focus on the moodiness, even that's what I told ChatGPT to do. I also want them to focus on the syntax. And I know that Poe likes to say, like, listen with an exclamation point, or other short little, exhortations like that. So I said, rewrite and include the phrase, listen. And I have here in the prompt in the blog, it says, include the phrase listen one time. That's because when I first prompted it, I said, but include the phrase listen. And then it wrote every sentence with the word listen in it. So I had to go back, include the phrase listen one time, and have a few more sentences and with exclamation points.
Yes, which it delivered on that. So this is such a good example of how you really do have to kind of hold its hand through through these examples. And sometimes you can almost overcorrect and then you have to scale back with.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that it's just a machine.
Yeah, the Amelia Bedelia example was really appropriate. It takes instructions very literally.
Anybody listening who's not familiar with that, look it up, because I know exactly what you're talking about. So then you asked it to do 2 other examples, Sandra Cisneros in the style of House on Mango Street, and then another one in the style of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. So I'm not going to read these, but this is the idea that we're changing the style. Did you want to comment on either of those in terms of what you had to adjust? Because people definitely are going to need to go and read these to really see.
Yeah. And I think in terms of the prompting, the expertise of the teacher is really important here, because the teacher gets to decide, are kids just going to be identifying that Cisneros talks about things like birthdays and church? Or do we really want to lean kids' focus to the shortness of the sentences, or the simple language, or the tense, or the voice, these things. And to do that, you want to keep re-prompting the bot so that you can have your kids focus on those stylistic elements.
Right.
And to me, that's where the fun comes in.
And again, you've got the speed. So it's sort of like, the difference between this and actually having to dig around and find examples, or find, you can just keep trying them things until you get what you need.
Right. That's right. And sometimes after 3 tries, you'll say, none of these work, but I'm going to do it myself. But at least I have this.
It's given you lots of ideas. Yeah. And yeah.
Right.
And that's the thing that for me, just as a person who writes all the time, like, it's that first draft sometimes that's the hardest to get out. And then I can change it all different kinds of ways. So sometimes just getting something to generate some thoughts for you is really
That's
great.
Right. It's your thought partner too.
And I'll just kind of zoom out for a second. Like, why is this useful? Right now, we're working with a student teacher who is using this specific use case. The big assessment for her unit, they're reading the things they carried. And the big example is students are supposed to write a missing chapter in the style of Tim O'Brien. And so what the student teacher has done is they're using ChatGPT to generate some examples. They're having kids try to guess which one is which passage was written by Tim O'Brien, which was written by ChatGPT. And then they're kind of going through and having kids look at features like the repetition of, there's that famous opening in Things They Carry, the repetition of the sentence structure. And so that's her way of kind of teaching students what stylistic techniques to look for as a scaffold for their big writing assessment.
I love that. helping them actually use the tool too to generate those is great. What were you going to say, Sarah?
I think teachers might be asking right now, so what keeps kids from then using ChatGPT to complete their assignment for them?
Right.
And we are, we're all very aware of that possibility. And we've been thinking more and more about what it means to say to kids, ChatGPT is out there. We know that.
Mm-hmm.
So number one, for this assignment, let's not use it because we want you to do that challenging work, or we're going to be doing a lot of that work in class. Or if you did use ChatGPT, let me know where you used it, because when I'm responding to your work, I want to be responding to you and not to the machine. So ways to be transparent about what it does, when it's worth using, and that it's there.
Yeah. I've seen somewhere, and again, we've been flooded with so much conversation about this tool, but I have seen one use where the teacher will say to the students, go ahead and generate a first draft with ChatGPT, and I want you to submit that with your final and discuss what you revise and why. And so it's completely above board the whole time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
especially I think if you're trying to imitate an author's style, there's already some plagiarism going on as an assignment. And so it's sort of like we're going to blur all of these lines, but the whole time they're thinking about stylistic choices, probably to a level of depth that they may never have thought about it before as writers.
Yeah, I think what you just described also, it's an example of how some of, I think what's going to happen is some of this shift in how students write is going to be kind of shifting towards more of a metacognitive process where there's going to be more emphasis placed on revision and editing. And I think that's great. I think this is
Yeah.
going to be a great tool to help kids get unstuck with a first draft. To your point, that can be
Yeah.
oftentimes the hardest part. But the other thing I'm always think about when people bring up the cheating thing is, in most of the examples that people bring up to say this is cheating, there's a human analog to it too. So if you have ChatGPT draft an outline for you, is that inherently any different than a teacher giving you, sentence starters for each paragraph? I would argue that those two things are actually really similar.
Yeah. And what I've noticed too about a lot of ChatGPT generated stuff is there is a feel to it that we've noticed on my website in just the last few weeks that the spammy comments all of a sudden are not written in broken English anymore, and they're longer and they're more in depth, but there's still a feel that's a little bit artificial. And so it's like we're having to really try harder to determine, is this like a real person offering a legitimate comment here about the content, or does this still sort of generally feel like, I really liked this article, it is a great article about this topic, thank you, and now go to my website.
Huh.
But it's just that they're written better, but it's still, you can start to get that flavor of like, I think a machine wrote this.
Yeah, and from the perspective of a classroom teacher, I think most teachers listening to this and reading the website, most high school, middle school teachers can tell their kids writing pretty well.
Right.
I get more concerned as the grade level goes up, but I would
Yeah.
say, all of the writing teachers that I know, they can tell their kids writing pretty quickly. This is not to dismiss the concerns around cheating. I think there's a more nuanced conversation to be had than just, this is a plagiarism machine that kids are just going to abuse all the time. I just think that's a little
Right.
bit short-sighted and a little bit oversimplified.
Yeah. And we can't get away from it. So we might as well figure out ways to use it
That's right.
intelligently.
We can't get away from the tool, you mean?
I mean, you can
Yeah.
only fight so hard to keep it out of kids' hands. So,
Yeah.
and
No,
the kids just get smarter and smarter anyway about sneaking stuff. So,
it's there. And I liked what you said about just being transparent and above board.
yeah,
It's there. It's a tool. Let's invite it into the classroom, and let's kind of take control of how we want to use it.
yeah. So this we were talking about sort of concepts, and so the concept that we were teaching about was sort of the author's voice. So you give some other examples here too in terms of different kinds of forms of government, and you had it describe representative democracy, and then asked it to give you other examples, basically, of
Mhm.
other kinds of government without using the terms for those governments, so that you can then feed those examples to students.
Yeah, that's just another kind of looking at contrasting cases so that you can develop an understanding of the underlying principles of whatever this concept is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so you'll notice, like in the post, we asked it to generate examples of democracy, socialism, communism. But because the concept we wanted kids to understand was representative democracy, we also wanted a close contrasting case. So we asked it to do a description of direct democracy too.
And then you can take those examples and then use them for all different kinds of classroom activities.
Yeah. And then I didn't like any of them after a while. Then I got bored of all of them and thought, well, maybe we should, change this to actual actions that somebody takes within the context of any of those forms of government, and do it that way because it may be more compelling. There's a kind of active verbs to look at. So we also we just told ChatGPT to do the very same thing, except this time use an example of a person named Vera, I don't know, trying to change a law in the following forms of government. And it did.
Yeah. And so it shows Vera trying to change a law and it doesn't give the answer. So the person has to have the content knowledge. So we have Vera trying to change the law by writing a letter to the head of state and presenting it to their court, along with signatures from other citizens. And then in another example, she proposes the change directly to the citizens and organizes a public meeting to make her case. And so there's a lot more nuance with these, and the students are going to have to think a lot more about like what kind of government is this where this person is doing these actions. So I liked that example a lot because it's like a word problem almost. And we're trying to figure out where does she live where she would be doing this? What kind of a government does she have?
Right. And which do we, prefer? Which world do we want for ourselves and why?
Yeah. First of all, I mean, you're just touching on a couple of different uses. I think probably a lot of teachers listening right now are thinking, oh, I could use it for this, and that. So we're just sort of touching on some really basic stuff here. But the third area that we sort of explored here is showing students different kinds of arguments. So let's talk a little bit about that last use case.
Yeah, there's just a million things to do with argument assignments. And I think the one that maybe I want to focus on here is what we were talking about earlier, and that is we often ask kids to write a quote unquote argument that nobody is arguing against. And oftentimes that makes the assignment harder for students. Because they feel like they're saying things that are obvious, which makes it harder to explain them. It makes it harder to give that so what, because the so what feels so clear. But if we can use something like ChatGPT to offer one way of looking at something, and then the student can push back against that way or adapt and moderate, then the writing becomes stronger, it becomes more purposeful, and I think the student can feel more anchored in what they're doing. So here, for example, we've given a prompt to GPT to say, generate an argument about a symbol in August Wilson's play Fences. And in this case, because we don't just want a kid to say, I found the symbol here, here, and here, we're asking the bot to not only talk about the symbol, but talk about how the symbol creates a really sad mood. And we tell the bot to insist that this is the only possible interpretation.
And I can see it in the example that it generated. There's literally the sentence, this interpretation is the only possible one.
That's right.
And so they're not allowing for other things. So this is going to then give your students something to actually argue against.
Exactly. Even though it's a machine, having something say, this is the only possible interpretation gives me a little bit of the jolt that I need to say, it's not the only possible interpretation. Here's another possible interpretation, you dumb machine.
Right. So you've got here like arguments for like in science, they can generate summaries of different scientific competing theories on things. And it sounds like you can give it in a balanced way or a very one-sided way, either, and talk about that. I would also assuming that you can ask it to back up what it's saying with evidence. Can you ask it to even back it up with textual evidence from like research? Can it pull from academic research?
So this is where it gets very murky, because some of the most well documented examples of ChatGPT just spitting out wrong information is when it makes up citations. So for instance, when we were playing around with prompts for the play Fences, it came up with inaccurate quotes sometimes. And so we would have to feed it quotes, actual quotes we wanted it to use, and say, please use this quote in your argument. So I would say the just accuracy is just it's not reliable at this point.
Okay.
Kind of coming back to your earlier question though about one-sided versus more nuanced. I think the ideal situation is you're asking it to generate examples of arguments that fall along a continuum of like completely on one side all the way to the other.
Right.
And you're asking kids to just kind of evaluate. They could sort by what they think is the strongest. But kind of coming back to that idea of contrasting cases, we want examples that span a range, and that's going to help kids think through. That's going to help kids kind of think through the criteria for what's a strong argument versus what's a weak argument more clearly than if you just give them polar opposite arguments.
Right. This is really higher order thinking stuff. When we think about Bloom's, this is like that evaluate level of Bloom's where they're actually having to sort of like examine these things and determine, apply their knowledge and determine like the scale of, one thing versus another. So you've got an example here, even of social studies generate different arguments explaining cause and effects of historical events, which is like so ripe for all kinds of debate, between social studies and science. There's so much potential, differences of opinion on that, and also whether or not people are actually backing up what they're saying. And so,
right. That's
so
true.
You're saying you can use it to generate that stuff and use it then as like a springboard for conversations and other writing and stuff with the students.
That's right. And you can even use it to offer a poorly constructed or wrong-headed or unsupportable argument, kind of the way you might in class, when you say, but I thought, that gravity meant everything goes up. So you can have the bot do that again, because when kids see what it isn't, then they're, with knowledge and teaching, better able to understand what it is.
Right. So before we wrap up, is there anything else either of you would like to say to teachers about this tool?
I think my big takeaway is like there are some real concerns with AI that are super valid. And there are some real practical things that teachers can do right now to take advantage of it. And we should be having both of those conversations simultaneously. We shouldn't stop moving forward just because there are real concerns about AI. I think given our backgrounds as teachers, researchers, like one slice that we can move the needle on is just showing teachers, how can I use this tomorrow to improve my practice? I'm not an expert in ethics. I'm not an expert in some of those other areas that are, super problematic. So this is where I think I can make a good contribution, and that's where we're starting. So
what I definitely want listeners to know is that we weren't really able to give you the full detail of these. This is really worth going and actually reading the post that Chris and Sarah wrote so that you can see all of these examples and really how they kind of responded and prompted ChatGPT. We're sort of giving you an overview of that. But thank you both so much for sharing this.
Pleasure.
For having us.
To read Chris and Sarah's blog post, where you can see all the examples of how they worked with ChatGPT to generate examples, visit cultopedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 205. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultopedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.